have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup.
And happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yes.
And in honor of that, we have brought together a really special panel tonight of leaders in our community and leaders in other communities as well, because there's a lot of intersectionality we're going to talk about. We have joining us Randy Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, 1.7 million members. J.W. Walker, Rise and Resist organizer, and you're also with Gays Against Guns as well, and lots of people on the streets there. And Jillian Weiss, who is the executive director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Well, we're very happy to have you here. I actually want to turn to Jillian first because you've had a couple of huge victories this week. The one that's made the news, the national news, the network news everywhere, is the courts that have put preliminary injunctions on the bans on military service by trans members and really slapped Trump down. By calling, let's see, the latest judge called his decision capricious, arbitrary, and unqualified, his tweet, and that does not trump methodical and systematic review by military stakeholders. So how are you feeling about this decision?
Well, I'm feeling very good, needless to say. I'm glad that the courts still understand that the rule of law is an important thing for our society. And I think the organizations that have brought these lawsuits, there are 4 of them, have done an amazing job, and I think that is a key element of resisting the current administration and its policies.
But on the other hand, the courts are a little scary because Trump is working lickety-split to pack all the federal courts with the conservatives.
Well, not conservatives, but we're talking about anti-LGBT activists and people like that.
We have some time. There's 144 judicial vacancies. You know, there have been 8 appellate vacancies filled. There's about 40 of those. There's been about 40 judicial vacancies altogether that are filled. We still have some time in the federal courts. I'd say the next couple of years, we need to be bringing those cases and winning them, and then we need to shift to the state courts.
So, Randy, you hang out with congressional types and the power structure. How is it that not a single Republican senator has voted against any of these judicial nominees? And do you see any hope from any of them?
Well, that's why 2018 becomes so important. You have tribalism going on in Washington, D.C. right now.
Hugely.
The likes of which, I mean, you know, I've been involved, like everybody here, for several years, generations. I've never seen this level of tribalism and turning away from basic civility, basic humanity, basic, frankly, meritocracy. Some of these judicial appointments are profoundly not just ridiculous in terms of lack of qualifications, but it just makes a mockery of the rule of law.
It does.
And so what we see, I think what you're seeing is the fact that the Republican Party, the establishment Republican Party, doesn't know who it is anymore. And they are far more scared of a primary challenge from the likes of a Steve Bannon, from the likes of the Mercers who are funding them, from the likes of the Koch brothers who are funding them, from the likes of the Tea Party, than they are with decency or civility. And so there are certain people within the Republican Party, such as Susan Collins, who has on content areas like on healthcare or on education or on even on these tax issues, will take a very courageous stand. But in terms of appointments, you see this tremendous tribalism because of where they want the courts to go, and that's very scary.
Well, you have looked the devil in the eye. You have actually met with Steve Bannon. So I would be very curious to hear your impressions of this guy.
So he would like me to say, and Breitbart would love me to say, just how evil and dangerous he is. And they would love to put that on their front pages, that teachers union president calls him this. I was very curious that he wanted to meet with me. And I basically, look, I am a representative of people. And whether I like it or not, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And I have to fight to make sure that public education exists, that we have an economy that works for people, and that we fight against bigotry and hate. And so I have an obligation to do those things.
Sure.
So when somebody from the White House actually asks or wants to meet with you, it's not, you can't, as someone who has an institutional responsibility, say, oh no, I don't want to because it's uncomfortable. So I refused to meet with him at the White House. I said, I'm tired of you taking like the HBCU heads and making it into a photo op.
Yes.
I am not doing that. So if you want to have a real meeting, I'll have a real meeting with you, but I'm not meeting you at the White House. And this is what was interesting, that he acquiesced to those conditions. He's a very smart guy. He has a very, he is, his viewpoints on things are in my views, just toxic and frankly horrible. But he has a theory of the case about white nationalism, white economic nationalism, that on some levels it's actually very good that he's no longer in the White House. Because if he was in the White House, that tax bill probably would have had much more populist elements to it. And he laces his populism with bigotry in a way that is horrible and against everything that I believe in. But he does have this view of economic nationalism. And that's what makes him, frankly, very dangerous, because he exploits the fear and anxiety, the fear of the other, and the anxiety that you hear all across America, that people's lives are not better than their parents. And that's what they want. That's what we all want. But he finds a way to try to exploit the fear and turn it against others, as in the Roy Moore senatorial candidacy.
So Jay, you're out there opposing all this stuff, and how are you reaching people? How do you feel a sense of? I mean, you are doing this in an indefatigable way. Rise and Resist meets every Tuesday night, has subcommittee meetings all week, and you do at least one or two demonstrations every single week. So how is that reaching people? How are you feeling about how you're turning the tide?
Well, what I think that Rise and Resist and other groups like it, there are plenty all over the country. What we're doing is we're letting people know that that's an option. That protest is such a great part of America. It's such a great part of our history. It's such an important aspect of how we as the people have gotten things done throughout the entire history of this country. And it's really important that groups get out there. And Rise and Resist started less than a month after the election last year, with a town hall meeting of just concerned people at the LGBT Center, just looking to do something, wanting to be with our brethren, and just trying to figure out some way that we can oppose this incoming regime. And it grew out of it immediately. And I think when people see us out there, it gives them a glimmer of hope. I think it gives them a feeling of connectedness, that there is actually something that you can do.
Well, we saw the people of Zimbabwe got rid of Robert Mugabe this week, but I was reading that
How many decades?
How many decades did it take?
And I was reading that it was so hard that at the end they were sleeping on the streets, and they said, we're not going back until this is over.
Right.
We haven't reached that level. We certainly felt it at the Women's March. on January 21st,
Yes.
where literally everyone got out on the street in the whole world to say we don't want this. But how are, what are you focusing on with all that's happening? I mean, how do we know what to focus on when there's so many assaults coming at us? Anyone?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you have to look at what people need. I mean, for example, we're an organization that is representing and working with transgender people. They need education, they need jobs, they need housing, they need to have health care, they need to be able to go into public accommodations. And so we're concentrating on impact litigation, meaning trying to get written rulings from appeals courts that will affect hundreds of thousands of people and give them the right to have, for example, an education that's free from discrimination, which has been a major problem for transgender people. They're pushed out of schools. If you can't get an education, you can't get a job, and you can't live that American dream.
So with the military decisions, with the great award you just got in Oklahoma for a worker who was a professor who was discriminated against, the fight in the past few years has been to get discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation just defined as sex discrimination. How are you feeling about how that is proceeding? Are we winning that?
I would say it slightly differently because I'm a lawyer and I always have to change the
Sure.
words a little bit. But, sex discrimination is something that affects everybody, and transgender people are protected from sex discrimination by the Federal Civil Rights Act, and the courts have agreed with that. And we have continued to see court after court recognize that if somebody is being discriminated against because of the fact that they have changed gender or gone through gender transition or expressed their gender differently, it's no different than someone who's experiencing a change in religion or religious belief or is being discriminated against because you don't agree with how they express their religion. So there's no difference there, and the fact is that sex discrimination affects not only transgender people, but gay and lesbian people and bisexual people, and there's a case that's going up to the Supreme Court, hopefully very soon, on that, because now is the time that we need to get that in front of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope it's very soon.
So the key today, I think, to organizing is to find the commonalities that create the coalition, and really, and you see this in the elections from this month in terms of 2017 versus 2016. 2016 was about how to divide people. 2017, those elections were about who was trying to solve the people's problems on the ground, in where people live. And at least what I've learned from the last year of spending a lot of time in red states is that if we focus, as Jillian said, on education, on helping people get jobs, not just on job training, but how do we fight for good jobs in community? How do we make sure that there's decent health care? People get to the fight against bigotry and hate when we start with the fight for what helps people have opportunity. And that has been a really interesting flip for me in terms of those kind of fights. So the AFT, we talk about it in terms of 5 values. We never shy away from the fight against bigotry and hate. We never shy away from the fight, for example, for DACA. But we start with the fight for good jobs and a voice at work and a secure retirement, for good health care, for good education, affordable higher education, and then for decent democracy and the fight against bigotry.
So we saw people at town meetings screaming about taking away health care, and we won that barely with 1 vote. I'm not seeing it as much on the tax bill, which is more devastating in a way.
I think what's happening is that the tax that what we've been unsuccessful at doing, even though the narrative has completely been changed around the country, this is a class issue, but what we've been unsuccessful at doing is actually making it quite clear how this bill devastates individuals. So, for example, in New York or New Jersey and California, middle class will pay more. services like education and policing and firefighting and trash pickup will be squeezed out. But because it is a tax bill as opposed to an individual, I have pre-existing condition, that will be changed right now. It's been much harder to actually connect the dots, although I think it's starting. And the other piece is, which is why the Republicans are racing through this right now, is that they want to race through it and don't want anybody to know what's in here. So they don't want people to know that people who have private jets will have new deductions, while teachers who pay, money out of their own pockets to help with supplies are losing their deduction. That hedge funders will have deductions, new deductions, and will have their taxes cut, while someone who is in a union who used to have the deduction for union dues, that no longer will be deducted.
And your Medicare and Medicaid is going to be devastated. So Jay, with all the assaults, again, how do you prioritize? You have these discussions every week in your group. What are we going to go after this week? And how do you prioritize? What is your priority now?
Actually, they're all our priorities, and that's a beautiful thing about an organization.
They can't all be.
Beautiful and not so beautiful.
In some ways it is, though, because we've been fortunate enough to maintain a fairly large size as an organization. We hover around 100 members at every meeting. And we're completely egalitarian. There's no real leadership. Everyone's an organizer, and so people bring subject matter that they're passionate about to the floor. Other people coalesce around them to plan actions, and then we move forward. If it's something that we care, if it's an issue that we care about, whether it's an LGBTQ issue, whether it's an issue of about disability, about healthcare, about access to subways, whatever the issue is, if it's DACA, it goes down. Like now we're starting a weekly impeachment action every Thursday at 5:30. It's going to be at Columbus Circle this Thursday. So we were partnering with Black Lives Matter.
On Thanksgiving Day.
What? No, I'm sorry.
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday.
Okay.
Next Thursday, sorry. We're partnering with Black Lives Matter of Greater New York and the South Bronx Community Charter School on their December 2nd March Against Police Brutality. It's the second annual one that this group of high school students has come up with, and we're partnering with them on that. So when you have enough people, you can have that sort of split focus and still manage to get things done. If we were a group of like 8 or 9, we would have to be much more selective in what we're doing.
And what would you consider a victory in the last year? Where have you moved the ball forward, as they say?
I would definitely say that the actions that we did in D.C. especially, but also in New York against Trump Care, against Ryan Care, against whatever you want to call it. I think that our actions, and that was our first big action, was our cough-in at Columbus Circle.
We showed video of that on this show. It was brilliant.
That was great. And then we ratcheted it up, and we had actions in the Senate office buildings where the hearings were taking place, getting arrested, continually with a very broad coalition of groups. And I think that's work that we can truly be proud of, and work that we can definitely say made a difference.
And how is law enforcement treating you these days in either civil disobedience actions or non-civil disobedience actions?
We have not had as many issues with law enforcement as other groups. We are a majority, somewhat older skewing group. Most of, a lot more over 40 than there are under 30. We're a whiter group, myself excluded, but we're a whiter group. That makes a difference. That we're a gayer group too. That makes that, in an odd way, all of those things sort of, make us someone that the police are more willing to work with. However, we had a recent action where we did a non-permitted march from Grand Central Terminal to Times Square, and we had announced it on Facebook. It was up there, but it was during the UN. It was shortly after a terrorist attack had occurred in London, and so I think that it kind of slipped under the radar of the NYPD. So when we showed up in the Grand Central Rotunda to do the action, there were no police there. I got there about a minute before the action was supposed to start, and walking in from the street, not taking the subway, and there were no police cars outside. So we just sort of managed to sort of get away with it. So we got going, and then right around the time that we were about to march out, I guess someone from Grand Central called the police. The police that came were that response team that was at the UN, because the UN was close to
They're
Grand
having
Central.
a big
What about all the surveillance we're paying for?
And so they got a little. They weren't the usual NYPD that come with a permit. So
Yeah.
they got a little rough. They arrested 10 of our marshals. The only people they arrested, barring one person, were marshals just for the marshals after we had cleared the intersection from the march going toward Times Square. They just started picking off a couple of marshals at each intersection after everyone had passed through. So we've had a little trouble, but overall not as much as other groups.
But Randy, you talked about spending a lot of time in red states. Jillian, before we went on the air here, you were talking about your days as a professor, talking to a lot of students who were going to become police officers who were very conservative and Fox News watching. So what kinds of discussions are you having? I mean, this will show on Thanksgiving night. We have a rule in my family: we can't talk about politics so that we can all get through it. So what kinds of conversations are you having that are encouraging to you?
So, look, Marshall Gans is a professor at Harvard, and he's one of the most, I would say, prophetic organizers I know these days. And he talks about both mobilization and organization, and connecting the dots and telling stories. So narrative actually really matters, and particularly with a guy like Trump and Fox News, where truth takes second fiddle to God only knows what. So if people actually connect on what is really going on. Trump ran as a populist. I happened to, just like so many others, really hate virtually everything he said. But people believed him, that he was going to help them and change their lives. And if you then point out all the different things that he's doing for the elite, not only is he not draining the swamp, but he's actually having the fox guard the chicken coop all the time. He's actually increasing the swamp. Look at what happened in terms of healthcare. Look at what's happening in terms of this tax bill. Look at what's happening in terms of budget. When you actually engage people on who they are and what their aspirations are, and start there and have those conversations, that's organizing. And what I see is we're actually in a race, because there is an appetite now, unlike November 7th, 2016, November 9th, 2016, it wasn't, I don't know if I can say this on TV, it was an oh shit moment. It was like, what just happened? And so we're in a race between people who now have an appetite to get off the couch and to do something. But that group of people has to get larger with a group of people who felt such fear and just wanted to shake things up. So if you talk with people about their needs and their aspirations, and you find ways, as you always say, to be very concrete about how you're going to effectuate this. What are you going to do? Legally, going to court is one way to do it. Electing people locally for school board is a way to do it. Having collective bargaining, doing something in schools, having a curriculum. All of these steps, being on the streets about something very specific, all these steps are very important to change people from being about, just wanting to vote to shake it up, to wanting to vote to improve their lives.
I think we've made substantial inroads with a lot of conservative people. You talked about the case in Oklahoma of the professor who just won a $1 million verdict against Southeastern Oklahoma State University. An Oklahoma jury ruled that transgender discrimination, that sex discrimination against a transgender woman was not okay. And I think a lot of people would have said before that, that'll never happen, it can only happen in California or New York. It's not true. Fair-minded people in Oklahoma and everywhere around this country recognize that gay and transgender people are human beings entitled to human rights.
A young lesbian just got elected to the state legislature in Oklahoma, beating an incumbent guy who was very right-wing.
And 8 transgender people were just elected to office
Fantastic.
around the country.
And that guts to step forward and say, I am going to do this, is just breathtaking in its brilliance, I think. And I do see a line from the shock of the election a year ago to the Women's March, surprising all of us at the size of the turnout, I think. I think we were just, praying for that kind of power, but just overwhelmed to see it manifest itself all over the world. And now to see the follow-through in the election, the first election cycles we're coming to.
But it has to be mobilization to action. And that action has to be related to something that people care about. And that
Sure.
goes back to local issues and local aspirations and wanting to have a better life for themselves and their families.
But what I don't see happening is, an election like 2017 that we just had used to happen, and the Republicans in power would say, we better be better or we're going to lose. And that's not what they're doing. They seem to just want to get everything, all the bad stuff that they can get now, the judges, the tax bill, all the, et cetera. And they're not saying, okay, this was our wake-up call. We want to work with you.
They're consolidating power. That's what they're doing.
But they're consolidating some issues, but I think that they will lose in the long run on this.
Well, but I think Randy's right that they're still afraid of the Steve Bannon right-wing primarying them. They're all concerned about their own jobs. They're concerned about their donors, and that's it. And until they start losing their elections.
Well, let's hope we can at least beat Roy Moore.
Chris Collins, a Republican congressperson from upstate New York.
Yeah.
Buffalo will lose millions of dollars if this tax bill goes through. He represents Buffalo. He said to the Hill newspaper, well, if we don't do this bill, our donors have told us that don't call us anymore.
Yes.
The bill, the Koch brothers, the DeVos family, the Shelley Adelsons of the world,
and the Mercers,
they control more than the people of the United States.
Yes.
And Julian is absolutely right. They are racing to consolidate as much power. Think about what the Koch brother network does. They focus on 3 things: get rid of the right to vote, kill labor unions, and kill public education.
Yes.
Because they feel like if they do those 3 things, then there will not be structures to organize or people, even if they want to vote, who goes out to vote.
Yes.
Those are the 3 things so when I say we're in a race, this is the great news is what Jillian just said. The great news is that it's not just people who are out there protesting now. It's that we are getting to people to be more fair-minded. You see that in poll after poll after poll, but they are racing. The Koch brother, Trump, Republican, Ryan McConnell, Congress, to consolidate whatever power they can before the 2018 elections.
Well, the thing that we have to remember, though, is that this is not new. When you look at when you talk about people that were bamboozled by Donald Trump and they went out and voted against their own interests, we saw the same thing under Ronald Reagan. We've seen, there's everything that Donald Trump screamed to high heaven during the campaign is stuff that the Republican Party was dog whispering. We're using their local organizers to get at the CCC, the Conservative Citizens Councils, all across the South. There's nothing that Donald Trump said out loud on the stump that everyone in the media and the press reacted to. Oh my God, I can't believe he said that. None of that was new. That's all part and parcel of what the Republican Party had been doing, just more quietly. And so now they're stuck in a situation where they have energized these people who are motivated by by these sort of very base instincts, these sort of fear-based instincts. They've brought them out to the polls, and now they need to keep them. And so they can't go back on their word in a weird way. And the congressional Republicans, the ones in the House of Representatives, they're relying on all the gerrymandering that's been done for the last three or 4 decades
Very effectively.
to protect them. The only ones that are really nervous are the Senate, which is why they're trying to rush all this stuff in, because the one thing that they fear is that the Senate will flip and then there'll be a standstill in the Congress. So they need to get everything they possibly can get done before January of 2019.
If the damn Democrats grow a spine and say...
I gave up hoping for that a long time ago.
Too many
A lot
of
of this is because of what they did to education over the years.
absolutely.
And I started teaching as a professor at Ramapo College in 2004. Shortly after No Child Left Behind and all that began, and where standardized testing was everything. You didn't learn to think about anything, you just were supposed to do what's bubbles on a test. And I saw over the years, I stopped teaching last year when I started this new work for the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, but I saw over the years students become less and less able to understand things. They could not distinguish fake news from real news. They couldn't understand a scientific study. They couldn't read a fact and interpret it. And that's the electorate that we now have, people who have gone to public education where they have not been given the tools that they need to understand what is being done to them by the corporate elites.
Over to you, President of the AFT.
No, it's absolutely correct. I mean, if you think about what happened in terms of the 90s and the early 2000s, it was all about test on English and mathematics so that your school wouldn't close, you wouldn't be left back, and your teachers wouldn't be fired. And, you know, if that's what schooling is about, and finding the perfect algorithm, then all the things that we know are really important in terms of schooling do not happen. And frankly, the stress, what we've seen, is that the stress amongst teachers is incredibly high. The stress, frankly, post-Trump's election is incredibly high with students as well. The bullying environment that we started talking about has gotten worse. And so...
Because people just feel freer to express their bigotry? Or?
People feel free. It is now viewed as authentic if you express your bigotry. If you express, as opposed to the notion of tolerance and civility being paramount, the notion of inclusion, it is, and teachers actually feel teachers feel like their hands are tied behind their back in terms of just trying to figure out how to deal with all of this because they don't know who will have their back. But to Jillian's point, I think what's interesting is we started actually moving from this kind of test and punish and fixation on memorization in about 2015 and 16, and education was actually not an issue in this last election. But since that point, what has happened is we're actually in a fight to save public education and to save it as foundational to democracy. So as we're trying to push in more civitas and more focus on civic engagement, we're actually right now fighting to have public education, as opposed to the fight we were about to have.
Yeah, let's talk about that fight a little because, again, weekly here we report cases of extreme bullying and violence and the paralysis of the system, teachers, administrators to deal with it, and we constantly question what is the way to attack this issue. How do we stop bullying in the schools or bullying of people generally? And Betsy DeVos is another one you've had a lot of interaction with, I think, and are fighting for public education in the context of, I've been to Grand Rapids, I've seen that DeVos hegemony there. It's scary. So what specifically are you doing to attack these issues, and what is your analysis of this?
So number one issue is, so first off, Betsy DeVos is the most unpopular cabinet officer in a cabinet that is very unpopular.
Among each other or among the public?
Among the public. Even more than Jeff Sessions,
Yeah.
even more these days than Zinke. She's unpopular because what has actually gotten through is both how unqualified she is for the job and also how much she actually hates public education.
And she's not shy about it.
She's not shy about it, but what has happened to, because I don't want to lose Julian's point before, what used to happen is that, look, schools always need to get better. And we will never be satisfied until every single public school is a place that parents want to send their kids are engaged, and educators want to work. And people and kids feel a joy about going and want to actually do the creative work that Jillian was talking about.
Sounds great.
So that's, but but that's not what DeVos wants. What DeVos wants is for, you look at Michigan. She wants public education to be defunded. She does not foundationally believe that public education is an anchoring institution to our democracy. And what she really wants is the privatization of a public good, and she talks about it in terms of choice. But it's not real choice because she wants to incentivize privatization as she cuts public budgets. And but throughout America, teachers and parents get it. And what's interesting is that overwhelmingly, we did a lot of research this summer with parents. Overwhelmingly, parents want safe and welcoming environments for their kids. It's no different than a trans kid wants. It's no different than a teacher wants. They want a safe and welcoming environment. And so what we're trying to do is, how do we get there? How do we help make sure there's enough social, emotional supports that we meet kids where they are? Now, we want them to be, but we meet them where they are. And then the second piece we have to do is we have to engage kids where their heart is, where their soul is, so that they want to go to school. And we have to teach, the third thing we have to do is teach teachers how to do the first two. And what is happening is that there is a lot of coalitions that are being built around public education throughout the country. 5 million people called the U.S. Senate. 5 million people have never called the U.S. Senate for anything up until then against Betsy DeVos's nomination.
Well, where kids are and where adults are and where everybody else is are on these devices, on our computers. And net neutrality is, hanging by one vote at the FCC and looks like it's going to go down. This is a tremendous setback in terms of corporate takeover and running everything. Is that something do we have a plan to turn that around? Can the Congress overrule the FCC on net neutrality? I mean, this is a huge thing. We're not going to be able to communicate with each other.
Well, it's going to be a censorship situation where, again, those big donors and the big corporations are going to have the voice, and anything that is not part of that is more fringe, is going to be cut out of the mainstream.
Yeah. But it's also an access thing too.
Yeah.
It's also it's an economic access, because then you'll be able to pull the internet apart, and there'll be a fee if you want video. There'll be a fee a fee just for Facebook if you want, or just a fee for all social media. That'll be higher, and then there'll be another fee for your email. And poor people are going to be priced out of the internet. I don't know what's going to happen with public Wi-Fi once that happens, because if public Wi-Fi, the state's paying for it. So I don't know whether cities like New York will increase their public Wi-Fi to compensate for these charges, or whether we don't know yet.
It is only a year before the next very, very, very big election.
Yes.
And half the people who could vote in 2016 didn't. Our job is to actually, if people care about any of these issues, even with gerrymandering, we have to get people out to vote.
I couldn't agree more.
And as we're fighting, because look, they're throwing everything at us at the same time. And so, everybody has to make their priorities. Right now, our priority is fighting the tax bill.
Yes.
And fighting for the DACA kids.
Yes.
And also, frankly, getting water to people in Puerto Rico. So those are our
Which you've
priorities.
just done some of.
but everybody. So I think there will be a fight about net neutrality, but it all comes within a very big frame that this guy ran as a populist, but he is governing only for the 1% and for the elite.
Right.
And
isn't this whole sexual harassment moment that we're going through in this country, I mean, isn't that really hopeful in a sense that now people are, women especially, and some men are coming out and this can change workplaces, this can change the dialogue about how we relate to each other. Isn't that encouraging?
The problem is that this has not been accompanied by a change in the way our laws work and our courts work. These women are not getting criminal convictions against these men. They're not getting civil judgments against their companies. I mean, we just won at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund 2 cases against Walmart for sexual harassment of transgender women in North Carolina and in Florida. That's the nation's largest private employer. But has that changed what's happening at Walmart? Has it changed their policies? No, they're fighting back and saying that they are not going to change anything. And so the question is, it's great that we're having this conversation. What is going to change so that the women who aren't famous and the women who aren't celebrities and don't have leverage are going to be able to get justice?
No, we read about farm workers who are being exploited by managers in these situations. Yes, this is
across the board.
Right. One of the reasons that the lack of collective bargaining contracts or the weakening of collective bargaining laws have hurt is that if you even think about, and you and I have had this conversation how many times over how many years, if you think about, for example, some of the contracts we did initially 20, 30 years ago, we wrote into those contracts no sexual harassment. We wrote in a grievance procedure. We wrote into those contracts no homophobia. We did it with legal words, nice legal words, but we essentially wrote into those contracts so that the law of the shop, the law of a public school, even if it was violated, was that. And so the union had an obligation. I mean, ours took it aggressively, but the union had an obligation to make sure that its members, if they were harassed, could fight that.
Some of the only protections LGBT people had in this country, in a lot of places in this country, were through union contracts because they weren't passing any state and local laws to protect us.
You told us that the AFT is in fact growing. We've seen the attempted destruction of the labor union movement in recent years. Where do unions stand these days?
Well, I think all of us are seeing, so the polling around Labor Day this year that showed that millennials were very much in favor of unions. They understand the need. So even without having any of that history, there is an understanding of the need that collective action is important to create power. And so what a lot of us are seeing is some growth. We actually saw real leaps and bounds growth this year because people want to have a voice in a real and meaningful way. And the other thing we saw in the last few months, just thinking about victories, is places that we've had intractable collective bargaining battles, like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Boston, Baltimore, all got to collective bargaining, win-win situations with their cities and with their localities. We had people on the street knocking on doors in Baltimore, getting kids back into the school system. So there is an appetite for collective action, collective voice, seen at the Women's March. But there is this kind of race that I keep talking about, and you're seeing it in terms of, frankly, young people.
So for the benefit of our viewers who are watching all this, and I'm sure they're admiring your work, how do you stay sane doing it so that they can do it, so that they know that they can do it too and still have a life? How do you keep it all together doing what you're doing, Jay?
You have to pace yourself, and you have to take time for yourself, and it's as simple as that. I'm fortunate that not all of my friends are activists. I have friends who, whilst they support the work that I do, they are, they're just my friends, and we go out to nightclubs, and we go listen to music, and we go to the park in the summertime, and so to remember to take time for that. I mean, that's the most. You've got to remember to love yourself. And I think it's really important.
Not get on some treadmill of I should do this, I should do this, I should do this. You have to do what feels good to you.
What moves you
On and
Yeah,
off.
Yeah, and you know, and sometimes there's so many different competing things because you know I work with 3 or 4 different groups, and you know sometimes
Yes,
I just
you
have
do.
to take a little time. It's like, you know what? I'm just going to be a good Southern lady and take to the bed for a day or so, and that's okay.
Where are you from?
What, Virginia?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so what's your analysis of the election there a couple of weeks
Well,
ago?
Virginia's been you know it wasn't any sort of huge surprise. Virginia's been you know been moving blue for some time. I'm from like one of the bluer areas, southeastern Virginia, Hampton Roads, because it's a very university-laden area and oddly enough, because it's a military-laden area, it has a more cosmopolitan feel. You have a lot more people from a lot of other places, and between that and northern Virginia, those are the 2 areas where the population is largest, and so it's been kind of slowly but surely trending blue over the last few years. So I wasn't particularly surprised. I mean, Hillary won Virginia. You know, I was even though that night was so horribly disappointing, I at least took a little solace that my home state, all my home state and the state I live in, both voted for her. But it's the South is going through a serious transition. We see it in North Carolina with the Moral Mondays movement. We see a lot of
but we've seen a lot of right-wing takeover in North Carolina.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But so I think because we've also seen a lot of voter suppression in North Carolina, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest battles that the Democratic Party, they've really failed in this in a massive way for a long time, and fighting all of these efforts at voter suppression. They should be doing exactly the opposite. They should be trying to get prisoners in jail to be able to vote. Right. But until we do that, we've literally had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were just knocked off the rolls, that were completely eligible to vote, that just weren't able to vote.
Well, this is what President Obama and Eric Holder saying they're devoting themselves to. We all need to devote ourselves to this. Although it was amazing that in Virginia they overcame those lines.
Yeah.
Because it's that 40% or 46% that didn't vote that we're reaching now, I think.
It is the people on that jury that Jillian just talked about in Oklahoma, who, if we can actually, in this very toxic environment, get through, pierce anger, and get to aspiration. I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but in a way that true organizers do, that is, I think, how one wins. America is not, you look at Trump's tweets and you think, is this a reflection of America? And it is not a reflection of the America that I have actually visited in the last 10 to 12 months. I'm not saying that there aren't people who are biased and there aren't people who are ugly in their words and their deeds, but if you actually talk to people, they want to have the freedom to thrive, and that is and you see it in the millions. I mean, we raised over $1 million for water purifiers for students and teachers and communities in Puerto Rico. That's the generosity of the American spirit.
I think all that is out there. I couldn't agree with you more, but nonetheless, and Hillary got 3 million more votes. And I think the Women's March and the elections we saw most recently show this hunger and show this ability to create a grassroots wave. But what the right wing has succeeded in doing is saying that the Democrats do not have an alternative. People want to vote with hope and with aspiration, but unless we offer them something to look forward to and something to count on, rather than what they perceive as the same old tired power structure, they're either not going to show up or they're going to vote Republican.
Well, where I think the Democrats, and look, I'm a member of the DNC. I'm a member of the Democratic National Committee. Where I think the Democrats went wrong, and frankly, one of the reasons that I supported Keith early on in becoming the chair. And
Keith
I think
Ellison,
Keith
the
Ellison,
congressman from Minnesota.
Who Roy Moore doesn't think should be in Congress because
Correct,
he's a
and
Muslim.
correct. He doesn't think we should be alive as LGBTQ people, and he doesn't think he should be in Congress. But I digress.
Yes.
Is because that what we stopped doing is being being the party of the people. Our policies are people oriented.
Yes.
But we stopped connecting.
Right.
And if you have a fact-free environment where people on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram are all operating on fear, and if you have the bots going crazy from Russia or elsewhere, and if you're not connecting with people, and people are seeing all this junk and horrible bigotry on their airwaves, then they don't, what we saw in 16 is they don't go out to vote.
Right.
And so that is why, as we're all doing all the other things we're doing, if we don't focus on connecting with people, I don't disagree with you. Look, I'm the Koch brothers. I mean, I have like a scarlet A on my back for all these different reasons. But they are going after public education because that's a place of opportunity. They're going after labor unions because that's a place of opportunity. They're going after voting because that's a place of opportunity.
And Social Security.
And
Medicare.
And of
Right.
course, environmental laws so
Right.
they can make more
but
money.
If they, but they're going after those three because they're going after the collective action on Election Day. And so when they get there, then they get rid of environmental rules, then they get rid of Medicare, then they get rid of Social Security, then they get rid of any of the judges. But my point is that if we don't actually connect with people on what a better way is,
Yes.
a better deal is, to borrow a term, if we don't connect on that as we are resisting, then what happens is that it's going to be, fear versus fear, as opposed to what is the pathway for people to actually have a better life.
Well, a part of that was that the Democratic Party was so entrenched with the power structure to begin with, so reliant on large donations.
Wall Street,
all along, that everything that the Democrats tried to do that was supposedly something that was going to help, lift the average citizen had to be tempered to suit the needs of Wall Street. It was that constant balance. I mean, from when the Obamacare, was a reworked Heritage Institute healthcare
Right.
plan. It's like if he had come to, so he basically came to that negotiation at the 50-yard line, at the middle, instead of like coming at it from the left. So you ended up after 8 years of Obama, and mind you, I love me some Obama. But after 8 years of him, it was very easy for the Republicans to go to working class and rural and lower middle class white people, not in the cities, and say, well, is your life any better? Did your life get any better? And it was very easy for them to see, no, well, it really hasn't gotten any better. And
But everybody feels like the system is rigged.
yeah.
And
So-
Citizens United rigged it.
So, Jillian, how did the trans candidates win in 2 weeks ago?
all across the country.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that there were a number of things. First of all, these are not candidates who spend an awful lot of time talking about transgender issues. They acknowledged it, certainly, but they talked about local issues. Danica Rome in Virginia talked about the local transportation infrastructure constantly. There was an op-ed in the New York Times saying Danica Rome is very, very boring. Because that's what she talked about. It wasn't
Yes.
splashy issues. I mean, she acknowledged what she needed to acknowledge. She moved on. She was up against a very transphobic and homophobic incumbent who had been there for decades, and people were tired of that. They wanted to hear about what are you going to do for us now, and they were willing to hear that from a transgender person as much as they were willing to hear that from any other person, and I think that's what we saw across the country. People are tired of identity politics. They're not interested in that. They want to know what is being done to make our lives better.
I think fresh young voices is a real key here. My fantasy is Al Franken has to step down from the Senate and is replaced by one of the new trans city council members in Minneapolis.
All right.
Well, I like the idea. I
One
like
step
the
at a
idea.
time.
I like
I want to
the,
zoom forward. We're in a race. We got to step forward.
I like the idea that Al Franken says, "I'll step down if Trump will step down."
Yeah.
too."
Yes,
Exactly.
that's good
I like
too.
that one better.
Yeah. But then there's Pence. Let's not forget Pence.
No, we're
Yeah.
up against it.
Yeah. All right. So we have just a few minutes left. So I really want to give people concrete steps. All the work you're doing is extremely valuable, crucial work. But I want to get people watching involved and empower them in a way that makes them feel good and feel that they can accomplish something.
Well, I mean, from my point of view as executive director of a nonprofit organization, and there are so many nonprofit organizations out there that are working to make our lives better, is to support your local nonprofit organizations. Organizations are working on everything from education to environmental issues, water safety, LGBT issues. Support us, and they've done that. I mean, we've doubled our budget and our staff in the last year and a half, and so people are stepping forward. Foundations, major donors, all kinds of people just giving online, and that support is crucial because it's these small organizations and some large ones that are actually able to push forward effectively when the public, the government, has kind of taken over and is working against our own interests. We need to have our own private groups that are working for us. It shouldn't have to be that way, but for right now, we need support.
And do you have room for volunteers in your organization, or is a legal defense fund not the place for volunteers?
Well, I mean, certainly we have some volunteers. I mean, for us who go into court and do legal work and so on, it's kind of hard to, plug people into that. But, we are looking for any kind of support that people are willing to give.
And certainly people stepping up to run for office or help those who are is a good way to
It's
do
a
it.
key issue. If we have more candidates who understand fairness and equality and the importance of a government that supports the people, we will have that kind of government.
Jay?
What folks have to do is they have to be prepared to get out into the streets, no matter where they are. I don't care if they come from the smallest town in my home state of Virginia, or if they're in a big city. Go to riseandresist.org. We're presently we're presently trying to reach out to lots of other organizations on the local and national level. We are encouraging people to start their own Rise and Resist chapters wherever they may be.
3 people in the street can make a difference.
That's all it takes. That is
Yeah.
all it takes.
All right, Randy, you got 45 seconds.
Show up, care, and fight.
There you go.
And it doesn't matter which organizations you do it with. We have grown our e-activist list. People say to us, well, even if we're not a union member, can we get involved? Yes, you can be one of our e-activists. Show up, care about people, and fight for the things you believe in and for the things that are horrible, and we will engage.
And pick your own subject, because
Exactly.
there are 1,000 of them that need work.
Right.
So you don't have to do anything you don't want to do.
My friend Ann Northrup says everybody just needs to do something. And we're not doing our regular reviews this week, but this show with Billy Crudup, Harry Clark at the Vineyard Theater is absolutely terrific. So
And on that note, happy Thanksgiving, or happy Thanksgiving if you're seeing us a couple of days late. We will be back next week. Thank you
Thank
to
you very
our
much.
guests. Thank